What happens when a decorated black detective becomes the target of his own department's bias? A tense standoff, a gun drawn, and a shocking truth about identity and justice unfold in real time. The night was cold, and Miles Johnson could feel the weariness settle in as he stepped out of his car, tired from a 12-hour shift. The world outside his car was still, with only the hum of distant traffic and the faint sound of a neon sign flickering across the street. The corner store ahead was just an ordinary stop on his way home, where he'd buy a bottle of water and some gum to ease the dryness in his throat. He didn't think anything of it when he stepped out of the car, adjusting the hood of his red sweatshirt against the chill. For him, this was just another evening. But everything was about to change. Miles wasn't just any man walking down the street in a hoodie. He was Detective Xavier Martin, a respected officer in his department, known for his meticulous work and dedication to justice. But that was a truth hidden beneath the surface, on this street, in his own neighborhood. Miles knew the weight of prejudice too well. And today, it would come crashing into his world in a way he hadn't expected. Across the street, Officer Luke Harris was parked in his patrol car, chewing on a toothpick, scanning the street for any sign of trouble. When his eyes fell on Miles, something shifted in him, an unsettling assumption, sparked by nothing more than Miles's appearance. The hoodie, the mask, the color of his skin, Harris didn't see a detective heading home after a long shift. He saw a suspect. His heart quickened, and his bias took hold of him before he even realized it. When Miles entered the store, Harris's suspicions only deepened. The robbery suspect had been described vaguely as a black male wearing dark clothing, and Miles, unaware of the scrutiny he was under, went about his business like anyone else. But the instant he stepped back out of the store, a car lurked a little too slowly behind him, and the red and blue lights flashed, freezing the moment in its tracks. "Stop right there, hands where I can see them." Harris's voice was sharp, like a gunshot through the night. Miles froze, his heart sinking. He hadn't done anything wrong, yet here he was, being told to stop by a fellow officer, someone who should have known better. A wave of disbelief swept over him. Why was he being stopped? What could he possibly have done? But before he could make sense of it, Harris was already out of the car, his hand hovering near his weapon, ready to escalate a situation that had only just begun. Miles knew how to handle tense moments. He was no stranger to difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't a random stop. This was a confrontation born out of bias. His badge was tucked inside his jacket, but Miles knew it wasn't enough to end the confrontation. He had to stand his ground, make it clear that this wasn't just about suspicion, it was about trust, and right now, he had none in Harris. As the scene unfolded, Miles's mind raced, but he kept his hands where they could be seen, his voice calm. "I'm Detective Xavier Martin," he said, hoping that his words would break through Harris's assumptions. But Harris wasn't listening. He was convinced of what he saw and unwilling to be swayed. The confrontation was escalating, and Miles knew he had to do something to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. As the tension between Miles and Harris thickened, the street seemed to narrow around them, the murmurs from the growing crowd becoming louder. Phones were raised, capturing every moment, every word, turning this already tense encounter into a spectacle. Miles could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, their quiet whispers vibrating in the air, but he refused to let them dictate his next move. He had been in situations like this before, but this time it was different. The line between the community he swore to protect and the badge he wore was blurring in a way he never imagined it would. Miles raised his hands higher, keeping them steady but visible. His voice, though firm, remained calm. "I'm not your suspect. I'm Detective Martin, off duty," he repeated, his words trying to pierce through Harris's growing suspicion. But the officer didn't listen. His stance remained aggressive, his hand still on the gun, as if the very presence of a black man in a hoodie was enough to justify escalation. Miles had spent his career trying to bridge the gap between his identity as a black man and his role as a police officer. He had been overlooked, misjudged, and even disrespected countless times before, but this was something else entirely. It wasn't just another case of racial profiling. This was happening in his own neighborhood, by one of his own, a fellow officer who should have known better. The frustration built inside Miles, but he didn't let it show. He had learned long ago that losing his cool wouldn't help anyone. Harris, however, wasn't ready to back down. "You think I'm going to buy that?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You don't look like a cop." The words stung, and Miles' heart sank. Was he not allowed to look like a cop unless he fit a certain mold? Was his blackness, his identity, a barrier to being recognized as an authority figure? "Why are you dressed like that?" Harris continued, the question laced with suspicion. "Why the mask?" Miles's frustration began to boil over, but he kept his voice measured. "Because it's cold," he replied simply. "Because I just finished a 12-hour shift protecting people like you." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of what Miles had just said. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every black officer who faced these assumptions, these biases, every single day. But Harris wasn't listening. He stood there, his eyes narrowed, refusing to see Miles for who he really was. The crowd had begun to turn. Shouts of, "He didn't do anything," echoed through the street, and people raised their phones higher to capture the confrontation. But it wasn't just about the video, it was about accountability. Miles knew this moment wasn't just a personal battle, it was a battle for his dignity and the dignity of every officer who'd been disrespected or overlooked because of their race. Miles stood still, his eyes locking with Harris's, daring him to make the next move. He didn't want this to escalate any further, but he knew it was a fine line between a situation diffusing and turning dangerous. As the crowd grew more vocal, Miles had no choice but to assert control over what was happening. "If you're going to arrest me, do it," he said, his voice firm. "But you better be sure, because everyone here is filming, and when they see you made a mistake, it won't just be me you'll have to answer to." For a split second, Harris faltered, glancing at the cameras surrounding them. The weight of his actions, the possibility of the world watching, made him hesitate, but still the standoff wasn't over. More squad cars arrived, and Miles knew this moment would define the rest of the evening, not just for him, but for the system he was part of. As the sirens grew louder, the situation began to shift. More officers arrived on the scene, the sound of their squad cars cutting through the tense air like a warning. The street was crowded now, and the spectators, emboldened by the escalating tension, started shouting at Harris, demanding accountability. Miles stood firm, his posture unyielding, his arms still raised, and his badge visible for all to see. The calm he projected, though firm and collected, was the only thing standing between the situation spiraling out of control. The arrival of backup didn't immediately ease the pressure. The officers poured out of their cars, their gazes shifting between Harris and Miles. There was confusion in their eyes, but also a sense of uncertainty. None of them had expected this. Two officers, on the same side of the law, standing across from each other in a standoff. One, poised and calm, the other, visibly rattled by his own assumptions. The crowd, now buzzing with the energy of the moment, looked on as if this moment of reckoning had become more than just about the two men. It was about everyone watching and witnessing a failure of judgment. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, stepping forward, confusion marking his face. His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension in his words. The crowd's mutterings didn't help matters. They only made it harder for the officers to determine how to de-escalate. They were on the verge of something irreversible. Miles's voice cut through the noise. "I'm Detective Xavier Martin. I've identified myself multiple times. This is a misunderstanding." His tone was direct but full of gravity. He wasn't just speaking to Harris, he was speaking to the other officers, the crowd, and even to himself. This had to end, now. The risk of it spiraling into something far worse was clear. This had to proceed with a 1.5mm camera on the back of every van that descended to the car park. The officer who had asked the question now turned to Harris. "You're telling me this man is your fellow officer?" His voice was steady, but his eyes spoke of doubt. Miles could see the shift in the officers around him. Doubt, concern, a growing realization that something wasn't right. The image of their colleague, a black man in a hoodie, being treated like a suspect didn't sit well with them. Harris hesitated, his grip still firm on his weapon, but the pressure was mounting. The crowd, who had been quiet, now murmured angrily. A few people shouted, He's a cop. The moment was shifting from an officer's authority to a public display of bias and its consequences. Miles had been the subject of scrutiny his entire career, but this time it wasn't a distant incident. It was happening right in front of him, in the very community he protected. Sergeant Olivia Green stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. "Harris, lower your weapon," she ordered. Her words were firm, but there was a frustration in her tone. She understood the gravity of the situation. Harris looked at her, then back at Miles, his face flushing with embarrassment. He was cornered, and every camera on the street now captured his actions. Miles Johnson took a deep breath, his muscles still tense, but his voice steady. "I'm not your suspect, and I'm not going to let this escalate," he said, his words firm and resolute. "I've been a cop for over a decade, and this is about bias, not about me." The officer's hesitation was clear. His eyes flicked to the phones raised by the crowd, the realization of being caught on camera now pressing on him. Slowly, the gun lowered, though Derek Foster's posture remained defensive. Miles exhaled deeply, but the situation wasn't over. Not yet. "I want this incident documented," he said, looking directly at Sergeant Olivia Green. "I want this to be on record. The truth needs to be known." The sergeant nodded, and with that simple gesture, Miles knew this moment was far from over. The acknowledgement of his statement was important, but the fight for justice wasn't just in the hands of those on the streets. It would be fought in the courtrooms, in meetings, and in the very way the department handled their biases moving forward. But as the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, one thing was clear. This moment had sparked something. People had witnessed an officer, a man of authority, being challenged. They had witnessed bias, but more importantly, they had seen someone stand up to it. Miles Johnson had been forced into a corner, but instead of submitting to the system's bias, he had turned it into a call for accountability. As he made his way back down the street, the adrenaline slowly faded, but the weight of the moment lingered. His actions had changed something. Maybe not in a big, sweeping way, but in small, significant moments. The needle had shifted, and that, Miles knew, was where change started. As the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, the gravity of what had just occurred settled over the street. Foster had lowered his weapon, but the moment wasn't over. It had merely shifted. Miles Johnson stood tall, his mind running through the possibilities of how this situation would ripple through the community, through the department, and, most importantly, through his own life. His breathing slowed, but the frustration lingered, mixed with a gnawing sense of responsibility. What had just transpired wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, something that had been building long before tonight. Miles's thoughts drifted back to the years he had spent navigating this very struggle. He had never wanted to be the exception in the police force, the black officer who had to work harder, speak louder, and fight against the biases that even his own colleagues held. It was a battle he had fought silently, day in and day out, earning his position and respect one step at a time, always knowing that no matter how far he climbed, there would always be that question, "Are you really one of us?" His position in the department had never been easy, and it wasn't about the badge. It was about proving, constantly, that he deserved to wear it. In some ways he had accepted that, but tonight something had snapped inside of him. This wasn't just about being accused by a stranger. It was about being accused by someone who should have had his back, someone who shared the same duty. The sting of betrayal by his own colleague cut deeper than he cared to admit. His own community, people who had once seen him as their protector, were now looking at him through a lens of suspicion. It was a painful reminder that no matter what he achieved, no matter how much he sacrificed, there would always be a part of himself he had to hide in order to fit in. The crowd around them slowly began to thin out, murmurs of discontent still lingering in the air. But as Miles stood there, the tension slowly giving way to confusion and resignation, something unexpected happened. The young officers who had arrived as backup, men and women who had seen this all unfold, began to talk amongst themselves. They weren't speaking in whispers. Their voices were firm and direct. The older sergeant, the one who had finally stepped in and demanded Foster lower his weapon, had clearly been observing more than just the situation at hand. She was reading the room, sensing the growing unrest among the crowd, and understanding that this moment could not simply be swept under the rug. Miles knew that in some ways the worst was yet to come. This moment was a catalyst, an incident that would spark change, or, at the very least, the conversation that needed to be had. But Miles also knew that it wouldn't be easy. He was a man caught between two worlds, one where he had sworn to serve and protect, and another where he fought for equality, where his actions constantly challenged the status quo. He had no illusions that this moment would solve everything. But it was a step, and sometimes that was all you could hope for. As the crowd scattered and the police officers began to clear the scene, Miles couldn't shake the look on Foster's face. It wasn't one of remorse, it was one of confusion, as if Foster couldn't comprehend how he could have possibly been wrong. That, more than anything, spoke volumes to Miles. The truth wasn't about Foster's failure to see what was right in front of him. It was about the systemic failure that allowed this to happen in the first place. This wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about the culture that allowed officers to question the very legitimacy of someone based on assumptions. The culture that allowed biases to be weaponized. Miles's thoughts turned to the internal investigation that was surely coming, but he knew better than to believe that an apology from the department would change things. Words, he'd learned, were easy. It was the action that followed that mattered. He made his way toward his car, his eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces, offering them a quiet nod of acknowledgement. He was well aware of the eyes still watching him, some in gratitude, others in curiosity, and a few still skeptical. But at least for tonight, they had seen the truth. They had witnessed a man willing to stand his ground, even when it seemed like the whole world was against him. Miles climbed into his car and sat for a moment, the engine idling beneath him. The world outside felt heavy, but he knew that he had done what was necessary. The weight of tonight's events would carry with him, yes, but he wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about his fight. It was about the fight for every person who had been dismissed, silenced and judged before they were given a chance to prove themselves. The hardest battles weren't fought with weapons. They were fought with the courage to stand up when it felt like the odds were against you, with the resilience to stay grounded when others wanted you to crumble. As the night settled around him, Miles made a promise to himself, a promise that no matter what came next, he would keep fighting, keep pushing for change, and keep demanding accountability. Because, in the end, justice was never about fitting in. It was about making sure that everyone had a fair chance to stand tall and be seen for who they truly were. As Miles sat in his car, the hum of the engine still in his ears, he couldn't help but replay the events over and over in his mind. The adrenaline that had once surged through his body was now fading, replaced by a deep, unsettling fatigue. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion of his long shift, it was the emotional toll of confronting something he had fought against for years. The bias that still ran rampant, not just in society but within the very system that was supposed to uphold justice. He stared out the window, watching as the crowd continued to disperse, some lingering to offer him silent words of encouragement. But it wasn't enough. Tonight's confrontation wasn't just about him. It was about the larger issue that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. The racial bias, the assumptions made about people based on their appearance, their skin color, and their background. It had to be confronted head-on. Miles knew that. The weight of what had transpired was heavy on his shoulders, but it wasn't the first time he'd felt this burden. Growing up in a neighborhood where the police presence was anything but welcoming, Miles had learned early on the challenges that came with being black. He had learned to navigate the world with a guarded calmness, always aware of how his actions might be perceived. He had risen through the ranks, becoming a detective not just because of his dedication but because of his perseverance in the face of adversity. He'd earned every inch of respect he had, yet it wasn't enough. In the eyes of Officer Derek Foster, none of it mattered. The confrontation had been a painful reminder that no matter how far you rise, no matter how hard you work, the world was quick to label you based on assumptions. Miles had seen it too many times, both in his personal life and on the job. The look in Foster's eyes was all too familiar. The suspicion, the doubt, the instant categorization. It wasn't just about this one incident. It was a symptom of a larger issue. Miles knew that this moment could not slip by unnoticed. The crowd had witnessed the entire scene, their phones capturing every second, their voices rising in unison, demanding accountability. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. For once, people had seen the truth. They had seen what happens when assumptions cloud judgment, when prejudice gets in the way of doing what is right. But Miles also knew that the real work was just beginning. The next few days would be critical. The department would conduct its investigation, the public would voice their opinions, and the media would spin the story in their own direction. But what mattered now wasn't the aftermath, it was the message that had been sent. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had been unfairly treated, every officer who had been wrongly accused, every citizen who had been judged before given a chance. Miles Johnson wasn't sure where the road would lead, but one thing was certain: change had to come. The department, the community, the world, they all needed to do better, and it started with accountability. He couldn't fix everything overnight, but he could make sure that this moment didn't fade into the background like so many others before it. As he turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from the street, he made a promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would keep pushing for change, keep standing up, and keep fighting for the truth. Because in the end, justice wasn't just about doing the right thing, it was about making sure that everyone was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. It wasn't just a battle for one person, it was a battle for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. And that fight, he knew, was far from over. The days after the incident seemed to drag on for Miles. His phone constantly buzzed with messages, some supportive, others laced with doubt. He had known the scrutiny would come, but the weight of it all was harder than he had expected. He could feel the eyes of the city on him, judging his every move. And yet, the pressure didn't come just from the public or the media, it came from within his own department. Even as the internal investigation began, Miles knew that the real test would come when the dust settled. What would change, if anything? Would the department's promise to overhaul its bias training actually lead to real change, or would it all be another series of well-meaning words that amounted to nothing? The thought gnawed at him, and he spent many sleepless nights wrestling with that uncertainty. But Miles also knew that this wasn't just about him or the department. It was about something much bigger. It was about the systemic biases that ran deep, that lived not just in law enforcement, but in every corner of society. It was about a culture that for too long had overlooked the humanity of people who didn't fit the mold of what others expected them to be. And in that moment, Miles realized the fight wasn't just about confronting individual officers or incidents. It was about challenging a system that had been built on assumptions, stereotypes, and biases. One morning, as Miles sat in his office, reviewing case files, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sergeant Olivia Green, the one who had stood firm and called Derek Foster down. She had a stack of papers in her hand, her expression unreadable. "Detective Martin," she said, her voice steady. "I wanted to update you on the investigation." She handed him the papers. "It's official. Foster's actions have been deemed excessive. He's been suspended indefinitely, pending further review. I'm also putting in a request for additional training on bias and proper protocol for interacting with off-duty." Miles nodded, taking in the news. It wasn't the resolution he had hoped for, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. The road to accountability was long, but this was progress, and for the first time in days, Miles felt a small spark of hope. He knew this wasn't just about one officer. It was about the larger issue of making sure that the badge wasn't a shield for bias, but a symbol of responsibility. Later that day, Miles stood in front of a crowd at a community meeting. His voice carried as he spoke not just about the incident, but about the systemic changes that needed to be made. "What happened to me that night," he said, "could have happened to anyone, but it didn't have to happen. It's time we all start looking at each other differently, without the layers of bias that cloud our judgment." The room was silent as the crowd absorbed his words. They had heard the stories, they had seen the videos, but now they were being asked to take responsibility for the future. Miles wasn't calling for sympathy. He wasn't looking for applause. He was calling for change, for justice, for humanity. As the meeting drew to a close, people approached him, expressing their gratitude for his courage, for his unwillingness to let the system slide. Miles knew that this moment, this conversation, was just one small part of the larger battle. But as he shook hands with those who had come to hear him, he felt the weight of their respect, and it gave him strength. This wasn't just about one bad interaction. It was about changing the way we view each other, about seeing past the surface and into the heart of the person standing before us. In the end, the truth had been spoken, and though the fight wasn't over, Miles knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. The work wasn't about winning battles, it was about creating a world where people were seen for who they truly were, not the assumptions others placed on them. And that, he realized, was the real legacy of his fight, one step at a time, making the world a better place for everyone. The story of Detective Miles Johnson serves as a powerful reminder of the systemic biases that continue to affect our communities, especially within institutions meant to protect and serve. In today's world, we often face situations where assumptions and prejudices cloud our judgment, whether in law enforcement, workplaces, or daily interactions. The key lesson here is the importance of accountability and the courage to challenge bias, not just in others, but in ourselves as well. Miles's calm yet firm handling of the situation with Officer Derek Foster demonstrates that staying composed under pressure can make a world of difference. In life, we are often faced with moments where we must choose whether to react out of frustration or take a step back and approach the situation with clarity and empathy. The story encourages us to question the biases we may hold unconsciously and to push for change, even when the road ahead feels daunting. To apply this lesson in daily life, start by actively listening to others' perspectives, especially those who are often overlooked or marginalized. Challenge assumptions, both in the workplace and in personal relationships, and be a force for change in your community. We may not be able to eliminate all bias overnight, but each small act of accountability and respect can help shift the culture toward fairness and understanding.